When you hit rock bottom, there comes a moment when pain no longer feels temporary. It starts to feel like your identity. You wake up, look around, try to keep moving. But deep inside, there's a silent question nobody hears. When did I lose myself like this? Maybe you're still handling your responsibilities, still smiling around certain people, still replying to messages, still pretending everything is under control. But inside, something broke. And it wasn't just a plan. It wasn't just a relationship. It wasn't just an opportunity. It wasn't just money, time, or energy. It was the way you saw yourself. You look back and barely recognize who you used to be. The person who dreamed bigger, believed more, had more strength, had more light in their eyes. The version of you that truly thought life would somehow work out. But now it feels like life has squeezed you so hard that even breathing feels heavy. And maybe you're not at rock bottom because you're weak. Maybe you're there because you carried too much for too long. Things you were never supposed to carry alone. Maybe you're tired of trying to stay strong, tired of starting over, tired of explaining yourself, tired of believing in yourself while nobody else does. But listen carefully. Rock bottom is not the end of your story. It's the place where illusion dies, where masks fall apart, where distractions lose their power, where you discover who is truly willing to be reborn. Because there is a version of you that cannot be built on the surface. That version is born after the fall, after the loss, after the silence, after the dark night where you finally realize you cannot keep living the same way anymore. In this video, you will learn how to rebuild yourself emotionally when it feels like everything inside you has collapsed. You will learn how to recover your identity, escape survival mode, rebuild your mind, discipline your emotions, control your focus, restore your self-worth, find purpose after chaos, and transform suffering into mental strength. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, every video is designed to strengthen your mind, expand your awareness, and help you build a life with more clarity, direction, and purpose. And comment below, "I will rise again." Don't write it like a random comment. Write it like a decision. The loss of identity. When you no longer recognize yourself, there is a difference between being tired and being disconnected from yourself. Because real rock bottom does not begin when you lose something in the external world. It begins when you start losing confidence in who you are, and that happens quietly. First, a person doubts a decision. Then they doubt a dream. Then they begin doubting their own strength. Until one day they look at themselves and think, maybe I'm not capable anymore. Capable of starting over, capable of winning, capable of building a better life, capable of loving, capable of being loved, capable of making someone happy, capable of smiling sincerely again, capable of having value again. And when doubt starts attacking your identity, your entire life begins to lose color, because there is something devastating about no longer trusting yourself. You can survive rejection. You can survive financial loss. You can survive criticism. You can survive failure. But when you lose confidence in your own ability, you begin collapsing internally. Maybe that is exactly what happened to you. Maybe life didn't just destroy your plans. Maybe it destroyed the image you had of yourself. Now you no longer know if you can rebuild your life. You no longer know if you can escape this phase. You no longer know if there is still strength left inside you. And the worst part is that most people never notice this battle. Because externally, the person still functions. They work. They reply to messages. They talk to people. They smile when necessary. But internally, they are at war with themselves. A silent war. Because there is a voice inside them constantly repeating, "You can't do it. You already lost your chance. You're not strong enough. Other people can recover. You can't. Maybe your life will never change. And after hearing that voice for too long, the mind begins to believe it. This is one of the greatest emotional dangers of rock bottom. You are not only suffering from pain, you begin redefining your identity through pain. Without realizing it, the person starts seeing failure as proof of incapacity. A relationship ended, so they believe they don't know how to love. They were abandoned, so they begin believing they are unworthy of love. They failed professionally, so they conclude they have no potential. They went through humiliation, so they start feeling inferior. They lost money, so they believe they will never become successful. Notice what is happening. Life events begin transforming into personal definitions, and that slowly destroys identity, because there is a massive difference between saying, "I failed," and saying, "I am a failure." The first sentence describes a moment. The second destroys an identity. And many people are trapped in that mindset right now. They did not only lose hope, they lost sight of their own value. They can no longer see strength within themselves. They can no longer imagine happiness in the future. They can no longer believe they could ever be admired, loved, or respected again. And do you know what happens when someone loses that vision? They begin shrinking their own life. They accept less than they deserve. They stay in toxic environments. They tolerate disrespect. They quietly abandon dreams. They stop trying. They stop believing. They stop seeing themselves as someone capable of growth. Pain begins convincing them that they were born to stay on the ground. But listen carefully. Rock bottom distorts perception. It makes you believe your current state is permanent, but it is not. A wounded mind does not see reality clearly. It sees everything through fear, through exhaustion, through frustration, through emotional wounds that were never healed. And that is why so many people give up too early, not because they truly lack potential, but because they lost connection with it. Napoleon Hill once said that whatever dominates a person's mind eventually shapes their reality. Now imagine what happens when someone spends months, or even years, feeding thoughts like, "I'm not enough. Nothing ever works for me. Maybe I'll never change. Maybe it's too late for me. Maybe I'm beyond repair." The identity begins to deteriorate. And a deteriorating identity causes people to stop fighting for their own life. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe there is a part of you that is exhausted from starting over, exhausted from hoping, exhausted from trying to believe again, exhausted from attempting to rebuild yourself. Maybe you have even started envying other people's happiness, not because you are bitter, but because you can no longer imagine that happiness existing inside you, and that hurts. It hurts to look at the future and feel no hope. It hurts to feel your confidence disappearing. It hurts to feel like you used to be stronger. It hurts not recognizing your own energy anymore. It hurts realizing your own mind has started working against you. But there is something important you need to understand right now. The fact that you lost connection with your strength does not mean it disappeared. It simply means it became buried beneath layers of pain, fear, and emotional exhaustion. Because your essence is still there, it is just hidden behind the wounds. And maybe this is one of the most important moments of your life, because some people only discover who they truly are after everything supporting their false identity collapses. Sometimes rock bottom destroys the versions of us that depended too much on other people's approval, validation, appearance, status, external recognition. And as painful as that is, it can also become the beginning of something real. Because now you are no longer being called to impress people. You are being called to rebuild yourself. And every true reconstruction begins when a person stops using pain as proof of incapacity. You are not incapable because you fell. You are simply wounded. And wounded people can recover, stronger, more conscious, deeper, more selective, wiser. But first, you must stop turning suffering into identity. Because your pain may be part of your story, but it cannot continue defining who you are. The mind in survival mode after prolonged suffering, the human mind changes. And most people do not even realize when it happens. They think they simply became more tired, more emotionally distant, more discouraged, more anxious. But in reality, something much deeper is happening. The mind has entered survival mode. And when that happens, the person stops truly living. They simply try to emotionally survive the next day. Maybe you know that feeling. You wake up exhausted even after sleeping. Your mind never fully slows down. Your body is present, but your energy feels far away. Even small decisions begin to feel heavy. Replying to messages, leaving the house, talking to people, handling simple problems, making plans, trusting again. Everything requires an enormous emotional effort. And the most dangerous part is that many people start blaming themselves for it. They think, I'm weak. I'm becoming lazy. I lost my motivation. There's something wrong with me. But listen carefully. A wounded mind does not function the same way as a peaceful mind. When a human being suffers too much, the brain begins prioritizing protection instead of expansion. It stops thinking about growth, stops thinking about dreams, stops thinking about purpose, and starts thinking only about avoiding more pain. That is survival mode. And inside that state, everything changes. The person becomes hyper-alert. They begin expecting disappointment. They interpret silence as rejection. They interpret distance as abandonment. They interpret small mistakes as major failures. Because the wounded mind starts living in constant alert, it tries to prevent you from suffering again. The problem is that while trying to protect you, it also begins imprisoning you. Because a person in survival mode avoids emotional risks. They avoid trusting, avoid opening up, avoid trying again, avoid expectations, avoid dreaming too big, avoid believing. Deep down, they think, if I expect nothing, maybe I won't get hurt. And without realizing it, they begin building an emotionally limited life, not because they lack potential, but because their mind is trying to conserve pain. There is an important detail very few people understand. The human brain does not clearly separate physical danger from emotional danger. To the mind, deep humiliation, intense rejection, traumatic loss, or years of emotional suffering can all feel like real threats, so the nervous system stays on alert. And living like that slowly drains the soul. Because the person never fully relaxes. They may smile, but internally they remain tense. They may try moving forward, but they keep expecting something bad to happen. They may want happiness, but no longer feel emotionally safe enough to receive it. Maybe that is why trusting people again feels difficult, or why believing in the future feels difficult, or why feeling excited about life no longer comes naturally. Your body may have left the painful situation, but your mind is still trapped inside it. And this creates one of the most dangerous feelings in life, the feeling of becoming emotionally disconnected. The person no longer feels joy the same way, no longer feels motivation the same way, no longer feels hope the same way. Everything feels distant, and slowly, they begin believing they lost their essence, but they did not lose it. They simply entered extreme protection mode. And here is something you need to understand. Survival mode may save you temporarily, but it cannot become your permanent way of living, because nobody builds an extraordinary life by only trying to avoid suffering. A person stuck in survival mode does not create, does not expand, does not flourish. They simply try not to break again. And maybe that explains why you feel stuck. Deep down, your mind is not focused on growth. It is focused on avoiding pain. Notice the difference. A healthy mind asks, how can I grow? A wounded mind asks, how can I avoid suffering again? And as long as that remains the dominant question, life loses movement. Napoleon Hill spoke often about the power of the dominant mental state. Now imagine the impact of spending years dominated by fear, emotional exhaustion, distrust, anxiety, and a constant sense of threat. The mind begins adapting to chaos. And then something strange happens. Peace starts feeling unfamiliar. Some people even sabotage good moments because they no longer know how to live without tension. When everything becomes calm, they search for problems, create conflict, overthink, anticipate disaster. Because their nervous system forgot what emotional safety feels like. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you have spent so much time surviving that you no longer know how to live lightly. And that does not mean weakness. It means exhaustion. Years of worrying, years of pressure, years of carrying everything alone, years of suppressing emotions, years of pretending to be okay. All of that comes with a psychological cost. But there is something powerful you need to hear right now. Your mind can be trained again. The human brain is not fixed. It learns patterns, but it can also unlearn them. You were not born condemned to fear, not born condemned to anxiety, not born condemned to hopelessness. Your current state is not your permanent identity. It is simply the consequence of an emotionally overloaded system. And reconstruction begins when you stop hating yourself for what you are feeling. Because many people suffer twice, first from the pain, then from judging themselves for being in pain. They call themselves weak, broken, failures, when in reality, they are simply emotionally exhausted. And there is a difference between a destroyed person and a person who is tired of surviving. Maybe what you need right now is not more pressure. Maybe it is reconstruction. Maybe it is silence. Maybe it is clarity. Maybe it is slowing down the internal war your mind fights every single day. Because nobody can hear their true essence while living in a constant state of emotional threat. And in the next block, you will understand why the first step to rebuilding yourself is not desperately trying to become who you used to be again. It is stopping the fight against reality and using acceptance as the starting point for reconstruction. The first step, stop fighting reality. There is something that destroys people emotionally more than pain itself. Resistance, because many times suffering does not come only from what happened. It comes from the internal war against what happened. A person loses something and then spends months telling themselves, "This should never have happened. My life was not supposed to become this. I can't accept this. Why me? Why now?" And while the body remains in the present, the mind stays trapped, trying to negotiate with the past. Maybe you know this feeling. You replay old conversations, recreate scenarios in your head. Think about what you should have done. Imagine how everything could have been different. And without realizing it, you begin living more inside the pain than inside your current reality. That silently consumes emotional energy, because the mind keeps trying to return to a version of life that no longer exists. Meanwhile, life keeps moving forward. There is a difficult truth many people resist accepting. Some versions of your life have ended. Some people are not coming back. Some opportunities have passed. Some seasons have died. Some illusions have shattered. And the more you fight against that, the more you hurt yourself. Because prolonged emotional resistance creates unnecessary suffering. Now pay attention to this. Accepting reality does not mean liking it. It does not mean approving of it. It does not mean agreeing with it. It does not mean giving up. It simply means stopping the waste of energy, denying what already happened. This is one of the most important steps in emotional reconstruction, because nobody can rebuild their life while remaining emotionally attached to what they lost. Imagine someone trying to build a new house while still holding the ruins of the old one in their arms. They will never fully move forward. That is exactly what many people do emotionally. They want to move on. But mentally, they continue carrying everything that destroyed them. Guilt, regret, anger, shame, humiliation, resentment. And the more they carry, the heavier they become internally. Maybe you spent so much time trying to understand your pain that you forgot to start healing from it. Because there comes a point where searching for explanations stops helping and starts imprisoning you. The mind becomes obsessed. Why did this happen? What did I do wrong? How did I not see this earlier? How could I allow this? What if I had done things differently? And then the person turns their own mind into a courtroom. They become the prosecutor of their own life. But listen carefully. You cannot change a past chapter of your life, but you can decide whether you will continue living inside it. And that decision changes everything. Because acceptance is not weakness. In fact, acceptance requires emotional maturity. It requires the courage to face reality without escaping from it. It requires awareness to stop romanticizing the past. It requires strength to admit that some things are over. And yes, that hurts. It hurts accepting that certain people were never who you imagined they were. It hurts accepting that you stayed too long in places that destroyed your peace. It hurts accepting wasted time. It hurts accepting ignored warning signs. It hurts accepting that you tried saving situations that could never be saved. But there is something even more painful, remaining emotionally trapped forever in what already ended. Because while you fight reality, you block the arrival of a new life. And maybe that is exactly what is happening to you. Maybe part of you is still waiting to become the person you were before the pain. But maybe that is no longer the mission. Maybe the mission now is becoming someone new, more conscious, stronger, deeper, more selective, more aligned with yourself. Because some versions of us must die, so that other versions can finally be born. And one of the greatest signs of emotional maturity is stopping the attempt to resurrect older versions of yourself. Napoleon Hill said that every adversity carries within it the seed of an equivalent benefit. But most people never discover that benefit. Do you know why? Because they stay too busy fighting against the existence of adversity itself. They cannot find wisdom inside pain, because they are still trying to deny that the pain happened. And that blocks transformation. Because transformation only begins when reality is accepted. Think about a physical wound. If someone refuses to look at it, it becomes infected. Emotionally, it works the same way. What you refuse to face controls you. What you avoid feeling continues chasing you. What you refuse to accept continues consuming your mental energy. Maybe there is a pain inside you that should have been faced a long time ago. Maybe you are exhausted precisely because you keep emotionally running away from what needs to be confronted. And running away is exhausting. Pretending everything is fine is exhausting. Suppressing emotions is exhausting. Maintaining false versions of yourself is exhausting. Trying to appear strong all the time is exhausting. Eventually, the soul begins demanding truth. And the truth is, yes, you suffered. Yes, you fell. Yes, you lost yourself at certain moments. Yes, some things broke inside you. But that does not mean your life is over. It simply means your reconstruction must begin with emotional honesty. Emotionally strong people are not those who never suffered. They are the ones who stopped running from reality. Because only when you accept what happened do you finally regain the energy to decide what you will do next. And maybe today you are still waiting for life to return to what it used to be. But maybe the next level of your life can only begin when you stop trying to go backward, because some doors only open when you finally release what already ended. And in the next block, you will understand how to begin your internal reconstruction in a practical way, reorganizing your mind, your habits, your environment, and your emotional energy after chaos. Internal reconstruction. Organize what broke inside you after a person finally accepts reality, an unavoidable question appears. What now? How does someone begin rebuilding themselves after becoming emotionally lost? How do you rebuild your mind? After living in chaos for so long, how do you regain strength when even getting out of bed feels difficult some days? Most people believe reconstruction happens through massive changes, a huge opportunity, a sudden burst of motivation, a dramatic turning point, some emotional miracle. But real transformation rarely works that way. True reconstruction begins quietly. It begins in the small details. Because when someone hits rock bottom, usually it is not just one area of life that becomes disorganized. The chaos starts spreading. First, the mind becomes confused. Then emotions become unstable. Then the environment begins reflecting the internal disorder. Then habits deteriorate. Then the body loses energy. Then routine disappears. And without realizing it, the person begins living in fragments. Everything feels heavy. Everything feels accumulated. Everything feels out of place. And there is something important about this. Human beings cannot live in chaos for too long without starting to emotionally deteriorate, because the external environment affects the internal state. The way you live affects the way you think. That is why emotional reconstruction does not begin only in the mind. It begins in the reorganization of life itself. Maybe you are waiting to feel motivated before changing. But emotionally strong people understand something most people still have not learned. Action comes before motivation. You do not wait for your mind to heal before rebuilding yourself. You start rebuilding yourself. And then the mind slowly begins healing. This is one of the greatest secrets of emotional recovery, because the human mind responds to evidence. And every small action sends a message to the brain. Maybe I haven't given up yet. That is why small victories matter so much. Cleaning your room matters. Organizing your routine matters. Taking care of your body matters. Sleeping better matters. Keeping small promises to yourself matters. Because every time you follow through on something, even something small, you begin rebuilding internal trust. And maybe that sounds too simple, but that is exactly how identity is rebuilt. Not through one grand moment, but through repeated decisions. Most people sabotage their own recovery because they try changing everything at once. They want to become a completely different person in 1 week. But an emotionally exhausted mind cannot handle extreme pressure. It needs stability. Think about someone who spent years trapped in darkness. You do not suddenly throw that person into an extremely bright light. First, their eyes must slowly adjust to brightness again. Emotionally, it works the same way. You do not need to rebuild your entire life today. You only need to begin. There is something powerful about returning to take care of your life after almost giving up on it. Because every small act of self-care sends a silent message. My life is still worthy of attention. Maybe you spent so much time surviving that you completely abandoned your relationship with yourself. You stopped caring for your mind, stopped caring for your body, stopped caring for your environment, stopped caring for your emotional energy. And that creates a dangerous cycle. The more disorganized life becomes, the more exhausted the mind feels. And the more exhausted the mind becomes, the less strength the person feels to reorganize life. That is why someone must break the cycle. And that someone is you, not through perfection, but through consistency. Napoleon Hill spoke often about the power of self-discipline and organized thinking. And there is a deep reason for that. A mind without direction creates unnecessary suffering. When life loses structure, the mind also loses stability. That is why emotionally strong people create order even during difficult seasons. Not because they do not feel pain, but because they understand that discipline protects the mind from absolute chaos. Maybe your life feels emotionally messy right now. But let me tell you something important. Disorganization is not a permanent destiny. It is simply the reflection of an internal season. And reflections can change. The question is, are you willing to start small? Because many people underestimate the power of small reconstructions. They want instant transformation. But true emotional change is cumulative. One walk, one more productive day, one honest conversation, one night of better sleep, one small goal completed, one cleaner environment, less negativity, more silence, more awareness. Individually, those things may seem small, but together, they begin rebuilding the human being. And there is something you need to understand deeply. You are not only trying to improve your routine, you are teaching your mind to trust you again. Because maybe for a long time you made promises to yourself and never followed through. I'm going to change. I'm going to start over. This time will be different. But the days passed and nothing changed. So the mind slowly stopped trusting your own word. And that silently destroys self-esteem. Because self-esteem is not built only through compliments. It is built through perceived capability. When you begin acting again, even slowly, you send a new message inward. Maybe I can still rebuild myself. And that is the exact moment something begins awakening again. Not instant happiness, but hope. And hope is one of the most powerful forces in human reconstruction. Because people who lose hope stop fighting. But people who recover hope, even a small amount, begin finding energy to continue. Maybe today you are still far from the life you want. But never underestimate the power of small daily reconstructions. Great lives are rarely rebuilt through emotional explosions. They are rebuilt in silence, one habit at a time, one decision at a time, one thought at a time, one day at a time. And in the next block, you will understand why emotional discipline is one of the most important skills for anyone who wants to rebuild themselves without falling back into the same cycles of emotional destruction. Emotional discipline. Stop obeying every emotion you feel. One of the biggest lies people believe during emotional pain is the idea that every feeling should be obeyed. If they feel discouraged, they stop moving. If they feel afraid, they stop trying. If they feel rejected, they isolate themselves. If they feel anxious, they assume something terrible is about to happen. And little by little, their emotions begin controlling their entire life. But emotionally strong people understand something powerful. Feelings are real, but they are not always reliable. This is one of the most important lessons you can learn if you truly want to rebuild yourself. Because when a person spends too much time emotionally wounded, their emotions become distorted by pain. And if they blindly obey every emotion, they begin sabotaging their own future. Maybe you know exactly what this feels like. There are days when your mind tells you, stay in bed, give up, stop trying, nothing is going to change. You're too broken now. And when emotional exhaustion becomes intense, those thoughts begin sounding like truth. But listen carefully. A wounded emotional state should not become the leader of your life. Because emotions are temporary states. They rise, they fall, they shift, they fluctuate. But many people build permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. And that creates destruction. A person feels rejected for one season and decides they will never love again. They feel like a failure after one difficult chapter and conclude they are incapable forever. They feel emotionally drained and start believing their future is hopeless. This is why emotional discipline matters so much. Because emotional discipline is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to feel deeply without becoming controlled by what you feel. That changes everything. Because mature people understand a truth most people avoid. Not every emotion deserves obedience. Sometimes your emotions are simply reacting from accumulated pain. Fear speaks loudly after disappointment. Anxiety speaks loudly after trauma. Insecurity speaks loudly after rejection. But just because an emotion is loud does not mean it is wise. And this is where many people lose themselves. They start identifying with every emotional wave. I feel hopeless, so my life must be hopeless. I feel weak, so I must be weak. I feel lost, so my future must be lost too. But emotions are not identity. They are experiences passing through you. And if you do not learn to separate yourself from emotional chaos, you will drown inside temporary storms. Maybe part of your suffering comes from the fact that you have been emotionally reacting to everything for too long. Reacting to people, reacting to rejection, reacting to fear, reacting to uncertainty, reacting to your own thoughts. And eventually, constant emotional reaction creates exhaustion. Because your inner world never becomes stable. Everything controls your peace. One message changes your mood. One disappointment destroys your energy. One bad day convinces you that your whole life is collapsing. That is not emotional freedom. That is emotional captivity. And maybe nobody ever taught you this. Your emotions should be acknowledged, but they should also be trained. Napoleon Hill often spoke about self-mastery. And true self-mastery begins internally. Because if you cannot govern your emotional state will govern you. Think about how many people destroy their own future during emotional moments. Some quit too early. Some sabotage healthy relationships. Some abandon opportunities. Some explode in anger. Some isolate themselves from everyone. Some give up on life entirely, not because they truly wanted to, but because they made permanent choices while emotionally overwhelmed. This is why emotional discipline becomes a form of protection. Not suppression, protection. Because emotionally disciplined people still feel sadness, still feel fear, still feel pain. But they do not allow those emotions to become absolute authority. They pause. They observe themselves. They breathe before reacting. They stop feeding emotional impulses immediately. And that creates inner power. Maybe right now your emotions feel stronger than you. Maybe your mind feels chaotic. Maybe your reactions feel uncontrollable. Maybe you are exhausted from fighting your own thoughts. But let me tell you something important. Emotional discipline is built, not inherited. Nobody is born emotionally strong. People become emotionally strong through awareness, repetition, and conscious control. And the first step is learning how to stop immediately believing every thought your pain creates. Because pain exaggerates. Pain tells you, you'll never recover. You'll always feel this way. You're permanently broken. You missed your chance. Your best years are over. But wounded emotions are terrible predictors of the future. A person in emotional darkness cannot clearly see tomorrow. That is why you must stop treating temporary emotional states like eternal truths. And this is difficult. Because emotional pain creates urgency. The mind wants immediate relief, immediate answers, immediate certainty. But healing rarely happens instantly. Most emotional reconstruction happens gradually, quietly, through repeated moments where you choose not to collapse emotionally, where you choose not to abandon yourself, not to react impulsively, not to feed destructive thoughts, not to let pain define your behavior. And at first, those choices feel small, but over time, they completely transform identity. Because every moment of emotional self-control sends a message inward. I am no longer a prisoner of my impulses. And eventually, the mind begins calming down. Not because life became perfect, but because you became more stable internally. That is real emotional strength, not pretending to be emotionless, but becoming strong enough to remain centered even when emotions become intense. And maybe this is one of the greatest turning points of emotional reconstruction, the moment you realize that healing is not about controlling the world around you. It is about learning not to lose yourself every time life becomes difficult. And in the next block, you will understand how controlling your focus can completely change your emotional state, your energy, and the direction of your life after rock bottom. Control your focus. Where your attention goes, your life begins to go. One of the most dangerous things about emotional pain is that it hijacks your attention. After enough suffering, the mind becomes addicted to what hurts. Without realizing it, the person starts replaying the same memories, the same fears, the same disappointments, the same conversations, the same emotional wounds, and slowly, their attention becomes trapped inside suffering. This is why many people remain emotionally stuck for years, not because healing is impossible, but because their focus never leaves the pain long enough for reconstruction to begin. Maybe you know this feeling. Your body is in the present, but your mind keeps returning to what destroyed you. You relive moments repeatedly. You replay mistakes repeatedly. You revisit rejection repeatedly. And the more attention you give to pain, the stronger it becomes inside you. Because attention is energy. Whatever you feed consistently grows. This is why two people can experience similar suffering, yet end up in completely different emotional realities. One person becomes consumed by bitterness. The other becomes wiser. One becomes trapped in the past. The other slowly rebuilds the future. The difference often comes down to focus, because the mind follows what it repeatedly consumes. If someone spends years feeding hopelessness, their identity becomes hopeless. If someone constantly feeds fear, their nervous system adapts to fear. If someone repeatedly feeds humiliation, resentment, and emotional chaos, their inner world begins reflecting exactly that. And maybe nobody ever taught you how powerful your focus truly is. Napoleon Hill believed that whatever dominates the mind eventually shapes reality. Now think carefully about this. What has been dominating your attention lately? Fear? Regret? Failure? Comparison? Loneliness? Self-hatred? Emotional exhaustion? Because your focus is not just affecting your emotions, it is shaping your identity. And here is something dangerous about emotional pain. The mind naturally searches for evidence that confirms what it already believes. If you believe you are broken, your mind starts collecting proof. It remembers failures more intensely. It notices rejection more quickly. It ignores progress completely. It magnifies mistakes. And eventually, the person becomes psychologically trapped inside a negative internal narrative. That is why controlling focus becomes essential during emotional reconstruction. Not because you should deny reality, but because your mind cannot heal while constantly feeding emotional poison. Think about someone trying to recover physically while consuming something toxic every single day. Healing becomes almost impossible. Emotionally, it works the same way. Many people want peace, while mentally consuming chaos nonstop, negative memories, fearful scenarios, toxic environments, destructive comparisons, constant bad news, self-destructive thoughts. And then they wonder why their emotional state never improves. Your attention is not neutral. It is building something inside you every day. Maybe this explains why your energy feels drained lately, because your mind has been focused on survival for too long, focused on what went wrong, focused on who hurt you, focused on what you lost, focused on everything that collapsed. And while pain deserves acknowledgement, it cannot become the center of your identity forever, because people become what they mentally rehearse repeatedly. If every day your mind rehearses failure, fear, rejection, and hopelessness, eventually your nervous system starts treating those emotions like permanent reality. This is why emotionally strong people become protective of their focus. They understand something powerful. Attention is one of the most valuable forms of energy a human being possesses. Where your attention goes, your emotional life follows. Your behavior follows. Your identity follows. Your future follows. And maybe right now, Your focus has been unconsciously controlled by pain, but that can change because focus is trainable. At first, this feels difficult, especially after emotional trauma. The mind naturally wants to revisit what hurt it. It keeps trying to analyze the pain, prevent future pain, understand every detail. But eventually, reflection becomes rumination. And rumination slowly destroys emotional energy, because the person keeps mentally reopening wounds that never fully close. Maybe part of your exhaustion comes from mental repetition. You are not only suffering once, you are suffering repeatedly inside your own mind. And this creates emotional paralysis. The future loses strength because the past occupies all mental space. That is why one of the most powerful things you can do is consciously redirect your attention. Not with toxic positivity, not by pretending pain does not exist, but by refusing to make pain your permanent mental residence. This changes everything, because healing requires mental space. The mind needs new references, new thoughts, new emotional experiences, new goals, new perspectives. A person cannot emotionally rebuild while mentally living in the ruins every day. And maybe this is the moment where your life begins changing, the moment you stop feeding only what destroys you, the moment you begin feeding clarity instead of confusion, growth instead of hopelessness, purpose instead of emotional chaos. Because eventually, whatever you repeatedly focus on becomes emotionally familiar. And emotional familiarity shapes identity. If you constantly focus on fear, fear begins feeling normal. If you constantly focus on pain, pain becomes psychologically familiar. But if you slowly begin focusing on growth, discipline, healing, awareness, possibility, your inner world begins changing too. And this does not happen overnight. At first, your mind will resist, because wounded minds become attached to familiar suffering. But little by little, your focus begins rebuilding your emotional state. One thought at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. And eventually, you realize something powerful. Your mind no longer feels like an enemy. It begins feeling like a place you can safely live inside again. And in the next block, you will understand how self-worth is rebuilt after emotional collapse, and why learning to trust yourself again changes everything. Rebuilding self-worth. Learning to trust yourself again, one of the deepest wounds a person can experience, is losing trust in themselves. Because after enough disappointment, failure, pain, or emotional collapse, the person no longer only doubts life. They begin doubting their own value. And this changes everything. Maybe there was a time when you believed in yourself more. A time when your voice felt stronger, when your dreams felt possible, when your future still felt open. But after enough emotional damage, something inside starts shrinking. The person stops trusting their decisions, stops trusting their instincts, stops trusting their ability to rebuild. And eventually, they begin living beneath their true potential. Not because they are incapable, but because they no longer see themselves clearly. This is what emotional pain often does. It attacks self-worth silently, not all at once, little by little. One disappointment at a time, one rejection at a time, one failure at a time, one humiliation at a time, until the person slowly begins believing, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe other people are stronger than me. Maybe I'll never become who I wanted to be. And the dangerous part is this. Once self-worth weakens, people start accepting things that destroy them. They tolerate disrespect. They settle for less than they deserve. They abandon their standards. They stop pursuing meaningful goals. They stay in environments that suffocate them emotionally, because internally, they no longer feel worthy of something better. That is why rebuilding self-worth is essential after rock bottom. Because no external success can permanently heal someone who internally feels worthless. And maybe nobody explained this to you before. Self-worth is not rebuilt through motivation alone. It is rebuilt through evidence. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings people have. They think confidence appears first, and action comes after. But psychologically, it usually works the opposite way. Confidence is often the result of repeated action. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, your mind notices. Every time you show up despite fear, your identity notices. Every time you choose growth instead of self-destruction, your nervous system notices. And slowly, self-respect begins returning. Because real self-worth is not built through empty affirmations. It is built through lived proof. This is why emotionally strong people focus so much on integrity with themselves. Not perfection. Integrity. Doing what they said they would do. Following through consistently. Keeping small commitments alive. Because every time you betray your own word, your internal trust weakens. And many people do this for years. They promise change, but never act. Promise healing, but keep feeding destruction. Promise discipline, but continue abandoning themselves. And eventually, the mind stops believing them. That creates a silent internal fracture. The person starts feeling emotionally disconnected from their own power. Maybe that has happened to you. Maybe part of your pain is not only what others did to you. Maybe part of the pain comes from abandoning yourself too many times. Ignoring your own needs. Ignoring your own boundaries. Ignoring your own exhaustion. Ignoring your intuition. Trying to survive while slowly disconnecting from yourself. And eventually, the relationship with yourself becomes damaged. But listen carefully. Your relationship with yourself can be repaired. And it begins with one simple but powerful decision. Stop treating yourself like someone hopeless. Because many people speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to another human being. You're a failure. You ruined your life. You'll never change. You're too weak. You're too broken. And after hearing that internal voice long enough, the person begins emotionally collapsing under their own thoughts. But healing requires a different internal environment. Not delusion, not arrogance, not pretending everything is perfect, but compassion with responsibility. The ability to look at yourself honestly, without destroying yourself in the process. Napoleon Hill believed that the human mind becomes shaped by dominant thoughts repeated over time. Now imagine what happens when someone spends years internally humiliating themselves. The identity begins adapting to shame, and shame makes people hide from life, hide from opportunities, hide from relationships, hide from challenges, hide from their own potential, because deep down, they no longer believe they deserve expansion. This is why rebuilding self-worth changes everything. Because once a person starts reconnecting with their own value, their standards rise, their posture changes, their energy changes, their decisions change, their boundaries change. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because internally, they stopped seeing themselves as powerless. And maybe this is the turning point you need right now. Not becoming perfect, but becoming someone who stops emotionally abandoning themselves. Someone who stops speaking to themselves with cruelty. Someone who stops defining themselves by their worst moments. Someone who understands that pain may have wounded them, but it did not erase their worth. Because your value did not disappear when life became difficult. Your value did not disappear when you failed, when you broke emotionally, when you lost yourself temporarily. Your value existed before the pain, and it still exists now, even if you cannot fully feel it yet. And maybe rebuilding self-worth begins exactly there, by deciding that your worst chapter will not become your final identity. Because emotionally healed people are not those who never fell. They are the ones who learned how to rise, without hating themselves in the process. And in the next block, you will understand how pain can eventually become purpose, and how some people transform emotional collapse into a completely new direction for their life. Purpose after chaos. Turning pain into direction. There is a question that almost every person asks after emotional collapse. Why did all of this happen to me? And for a long time. That question usually comes from pain, from confusion, from frustration, from grief. The person wants an explanation for the suffering, a reason for the loss, a meaning for the chaos. But eventually, something changes. The question slowly evolves. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the person begins asking, "What can this pain transform me into?" And that question changes everything. Because there comes a moment in emotional reconstruction where suffering stops being only destruction and begins becoming direction. Not immediately, not romantically. Pain is painful. Loss hurts. Rejection hurts. Loneliness hurts. Failure hurts. Emotional collapse hurts. But sometimes, after the chaos settles, a person begins seeing life differently, more clearly, because suffering strips away illusions. It exposes what was false, what was unsustainable, what was emotionally empty, and many people only discover who they truly are after losing the life they thought they wanted. Maybe that is exactly where you are right now. Maybe the life you lost was not fully aligned with who you were becoming. Maybe you spent years chasing approval instead of purpose. Years trying to fit into environments that drained your soul. Years building a version of yourself designed to please others. Until one day, everything collapsed. And at first, it felt like punishment. But later, it began looking more like awakening. Because some breakdowns are actually revelations. Not every collapse is the end of your life. Some collapses are the end of illusion. And there is something powerful about reaching the point where you can no longer betray yourself just to maintain a certain image. Because pain changes priorities. Things that once felt important suddenly lose meaning. Status loses meaning. Superficial validation loses meaning. Pretending loses meaning. And the soul begins searching for something deeper. Truth, alignment, peace, meaning, purpose. This is why many people radically change after emotional suffering. Not because pain automatically makes people wiser, but because pain forces reflection. It interrupts unconscious living. A person who never suffers deeply can spend decades distracted. But suffering forces someone to stop and ask, what kind of life am I actually building? What kind of person am I becoming? What truly matters? What can no longer continue? And those questions begin transforming identity. Napoleon Hill believed that adversity often carries hidden opportunity, but hidden opportunity rarely appears immediately. First comes confusion, then emotional resistance, then exhaustion, and only later, if the person remains conscious, wisdom begins emerging from the pain, because suffering can either harden someone or deepen someone. And the difference often depends on awareness. Some people become bitter after pain. Others become purposeful. Some spend the rest of their lives emotionally trapped in what happened. Others use the experience as fuel for transformation. Maybe one of the reasons you suffered so deeply is because life was trying to wake you up from a version of yourself that no longer fit your future. That realization is uncomfortable, because it means accepting that some identities must end. Some relationships must end. Some habits must end. Some mentalities must end. Not to destroy you, but to create space for a more conscious version of you to emerge. And maybe that is why the old version of your life collapsed. Not because your story is over, but because your next chapter required a different person, a stronger person, a wiser person, a more emotionally disciplined person, a more aligned person. And no, that transformation is not easy, because growth after pain requires rebuilding while still emotionally wounded. It requires moving forward while still healing, still grieving, still confused sometimes. But purpose is often born exactly there, not in comfort, but in reconstruction. Think about how many people discover their true strength only after surviving something they thought would destroy them. Before the pain, they underestimated themselves. After the pain, they discover resilience they never knew existed. And maybe one day, you will look back at this season differently, not as the chapter that ended your life, but as the chapter that forced you to finally become yourself. Because sometimes life removes what distracts you, so you can finally hear your own soul again. And purpose changes emotional energy completely. A person without purpose becomes consumed by pain, but a person with purpose begins transforming pain into movement, into discipline, into awareness, into growth, into contribution, into wisdom. That does not mean they stop feeling hurt. It means the pain finally gains direction. And direction is powerful, because direction is suffering meaning. A person can survive incredibly difficult seasons if they believe the pain is building something inside them. That is why emotionally healed people often become different after rock bottom. Calmer, stronger, more selective, less desperate for approval, less emotionally dependent, more intentional. Because suffering forced them to discover what truly matters. And maybe your greatest transformation will not come from avoiding pain. Maybe it will come from learning how to use pain consciously, not as identity, not as victimhood, not as emotional prison, but as fuel. Fuel for growth, fuel for awareness, fuel for becoming someone stronger than the version of you that entered the storm. And maybe this is the moment where you stop asking, why did life break me? And start asking, what is life trying to build through me? Because that question marks the beginning of a completely different mindset. The mindset of someone who is no longer only surviving, but beginning to rise again. And in the next block, you will understand how suffering can become mental strength and why some of the strongest people in the world were once emotionally broken too. Transforming suffering into mental strength. There is something most people never realize about emotional pain. Suffering, by itself, does not make someone stronger. In fact, pain alone can destroy a person. It can make them bitter, fearful, emotionally numb, hopeless. This is why some people go through suffering and collapse, while others go through suffering and become extraordinarily strong. The difference is not the pain itself. The difference is what they do with the pain. Because suffering only becomes strength when it is consciously transformed. And that transformation changes everything. Maybe right now you feel emotionally broken. Maybe part of you feels exhausted from fighting internal battles nobody else can see. But let me tell you something important. Some of the strongest minds in the world were once emotionally shattered too. Strength is rarely born in comfort. It is usually born in survival, born in loss, born in rejection, born in loneliness, born in moments where people thought they would never recover. Because pain forces a human being to confront themselves deeply. And if they choose awareness instead of destruction, something powerful begins happening. The suffering starts creating depth. This is why people who survive difficult seasons often become different afterward. More observant, more emotionally intelligent, more resilient, more selective, more grounded. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because conscious suffering creates wisdom, and wisdom creates strength. Think about this carefully. Before emotional pain, many people live unconsciously. They avoid reflection, avoid self-awareness, avoid difficult truths. But pain interrupts that. Pain forces someone to look inward, to question life, to question identity, to question habits, to question emotional patterns. And eventually, that level of self-awareness creates transformation. This is why emotional suffering can become mental strength, not because suffering automatically improves people, but because suffering can reveal parts of ourselves we never would have discovered otherwise. Maybe before rock bottom, you were living mostly on autopilot, trying to please everyone, ignoring your emotional needs, seeking validation constantly, accepting less than you deserved. But pain changes perspective. It forces clarity, and clarity can become power. Napoleon Hill believed that adversity could become a source of equivalent benefit when approached with the right mindset. And maybe one of the hidden benefits of suffering is emotional awakening. Because after enough pain, people stop seeing life superficially. They become more intentional. They stop wasting energy on meaningless things. Stop chasing empty approval. Stop ignoring their intuition. Because suffering teaches lessons comfort rarely teaches. And one of those lessons is this: your mind must become stronger than your circumstances. This is one of the greatest turning points in emotional reconstruction. The moment a person realizes, I cannot control everything life does to me, but I can control who I become through it. That realization creates inner power. Because mentally strong people are not people who never struggle emotionally. They are people who learned how not to surrender their identity to suffering. And this takes practice. Because pain naturally tries to convince you that you are powerless, that life defeated you, that your future disappeared, that your best years are over. But mentally strong people challenge those internal narratives, not through denial, through conscious rebuilding. They understand that pain affects emotions, but it does not have to define identity. This is why emotional resilience matters so much. Resilience is not pretending to be okay. It is the ability to continue rebuilding, even while carrying scars. And scars are not proof of weakness. They are proof that something hurt you, and you survived it. Maybe part of your suffering came from believing you had to emerge from pain unchanged. But transformation changes people. After emotional collapse, you do not return as the exact same person, and maybe that is a good thing. Because some versions of you were never sustainable. Some versions tolerated too much, accepted too little, ignored too many emotional wounds. Pain exposed that, and exposure creates opportunity. Opportunity to become more conscious, more emotionally disciplined, more selective about who and what enters your life. This is why mentally strong people often become calmer after suffering, not because life became easier, but because pain forced them to develop inner stability. They stop panicking over everything, stop collapsing emotionally at every obstacle, stop needing constant external validation, because suffering taught them endurance, and endurance creates psychological strength. But let me make something very clear. Transforming suffering into strength does not mean suppressing emotions. It does not mean becoming cold, emotionless, detached from humanity. Real strength is not emotional numbness. Real strength is emotional stability, the ability to feel pain without letting pain completely control your behavior, the ability to experience fear without allowing fear to dominate your future, the ability to grieve without abandoning yourself entirely. That is real power. And maybe this is the lesson your pain has been trying to teach you all along. You are stronger than the version of yourself that first entered this storm, even if you do not fully see it yet. Because surviving emotional collapse changes people internally. It forces growth, forces awareness, forces maturity, and one day, you may realize that the pain you once thought would destroy you actually built the strongest parts of your character. Not immediately, not easily, but gradually. Through every moment you chose not to quit. Every moment you chose awareness over destruction. Every moment you chose rebuilding over surrender. That is how mental strength is formed, quietly, one difficult decision at a time. And in the final block, You will understand why rebuilding yourself does not mean becoming who you used to be again. It means becoming someone wiser, stronger, and more aligned than ever before. You will not become who you used to be again. There is something many people secretly hope for after emotional pain. They hope life will return to the way it used to be. They hope to become the person they were before the heartbreak, before the collapse, before the betrayal, before the loneliness, before the emotional exhaustion. But eventually, a difficult truth appears. You will not become who you used to be again. And maybe that is not a tragedy. Maybe that is the beginning of your evolution. Because emotional reconstruction is not about returning to an old identity. It is about becoming someone more conscious than the person who entered the storm. This is one of the most important things you must understand if you truly want to rise again. Pain changes people, not only emotionally, but psychologically, spiritually, mentally. And after deep suffering, you begin seeing life differently. Things that once mattered lose importance. Things you once tolerated become unbearable. Things you once ignored become impossible not to notice. Because pain removes illusions. And once certain illusions disappear, you cannot fully return to who you used to be. Maybe before rock bottom, you ignored your own emotional needs. Maybe you abandoned yourself trying to save everyone else. Maybe you tolerated disrespect because you feared loneliness. Maybe you built your identity around approval, around appearance, around external validation. But suffering exposed what was unsustainable. And painful as that was, it also created awareness. Because emotionally mature people stop asking, "How do I become my old self again?" and begin asking, "How do I become someone stronger and wiser than before?" That question changes everything, because the goal is no longer emotional nostalgia. The goal becomes conscious transformation. And transformation requires letting certain versions of yourself die. The insecure version, the emotionally dependent version, the self-abandoning version, the version that constantly ignored intuition, the version that accepted less than they deserved. Some identities must end, so healthier identities can emerge. And this process feels uncomfortable, because growth often feels like grief. Part of you misses who you used to be, even if that version of you is suffering too. Maybe you miss your innocence, your emotional openness, your old dreams, your old expectations about life. But healing does not mean becoming naive again. It means becoming wiser without becoming emotionally dead. That is real growth. Not bitterness, wisdom, because there is a huge difference between becoming emotionally guarded and becoming emotionally conscious. A wounded person says, "I will never trust again." A healed person says, "I will trust more carefully." A wounded person says, "I will never love again." A healed person says, "I will no longer abandon myself for love." A wounded person becomes emotionally closed. A healed person becomes emotionally discerning. And discernment changes everything. Because emotionally rebuilt people stop living desperately. They stop chasing validation everywhere. Stop begging for attention. Stop sacrificing their peace to maintain relationships that destroy them. Not because they became cold, but because they finally understand their own value. Napoleon Hill believed that thoughts repeated consistently shape identity and reality. And maybe for the first time in your life, you are beginning to consciously choose who you will become, not based on pain, not based on fear, not based on rejection, but based on awareness. That is powerful, because most people never consciously rebuild themselves. They simply react to life unconsciously for decades. But emotional suffering can awaken a person. It can force someone to stop surviving mechanically and begin living intentionally. Maybe this painful season was not sent to destroy your future. Maybe it was meant to interrupt a version of life that no longer aligned with your soul. And maybe now, for the first time, you are finally becoming real. Not perfect, real. More honest with yourself, more aware of your emotional patterns, more protective of your peace, more selective about who enters your life, more intentional about your energy. And that version of you is stronger than the old one, not because pain made you superior, but because pain made you conscious. There is a certain type of strength that only emotionally rebuilt people carry, a quiet strength, the kind that no longer needs to prove everything, no longer panics over every obstacle, no longer collapses every time life becomes uncertain, because they already survived emotional darkness once. And surviving that changes a human being permanently. Maybe right now you still feel like you are rebuilding slowly. That is okay. Healing is rarely dramatic. Most healing happens invisibly, internally, in the way you think, the way you react, the way you speak to yourself, the standards you begin creating, the boundaries you finally stop ignoring. Little by little, you stop becoming a survivor of pain and start becoming the architect of a new life. And maybe this is the moment where you finally understand something powerful. Rock bottom did not only reveal your pain, it revealed your capacity to rebuild. Because many people collapse emotionally, but never consciously rise again. You are different. You are still here, still listening, still searching, still trying to understand yourself, still hoping, even after everything. And that matters more than you realize, because the decision to keep rebuilding yourself, even slowly, is already proof that part of your spirit refused to die. So no, you will never become exactly who you used to be. But maybe one day you will become someone wiser, calmer, stronger, more aligned, more emotionally free. Someone who no longer sees pain as the end of life, but as the moment life forced them to finally awaken. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, every video is designed to help you strengthen your mind, rebuild your inner world, and create a life with more clarity, discipline, purpose, and emotional power. And comment below, I will rise again, not as motivation, as a decision.